I have three titles about what I'm speaking about today. It's the cumulative effects of wildlife in southwestern Montana, or death by incrementalism, or how the cows lost access to the public lands. I live in a small place called Grant, Montana, and I used to introduce myself and where I live this way. It's right on the Lewis and Clark Trail. It's right where they buried their boats, walked to the top of the hill, thought they'd see the Pacific coast, and saw what would someday be Idaho, and I think they were just a little daunted that day. But what I have to add to it now is I also live smack dab between where wolves were reintroduced and turned loose in Wyoming in Yellowstone National Park, and where they were turned loose in Idaho in a wilderness area. So that's what we've been living with. When Lewis and Clark went through and they wrote this down, so it's recorded, there were no game in that area. The Indians were starving. Lewis and Clark did see one deer, they shot it, and the Indians were glad to have it. The Barretts, the family and the ranch that I'm with, they have been in the same area since 1868, and that was prior to Montana becoming a state, prior to Forest Service land, prior to BLM, and by 1930 there still were no game in the area. And some of the ranchers around that area, as people did throughout Montana, took stock trucks and went and got elk and brought them back. Shortly after that, as the elk population was building up, we had to eradicate wolves in Horse Prairie, and we had to do it because they're selective killers, and what they wanted were the horses. And we needed the horses to put up the hay, we needed the horses to move the cows, we needed the horses to feed the hay, we needed the horses if we went anywhere, so that's why we eradicated the wolves. In the 1992 elk management plan says for the unit of elk right where we live, they were just amazed at all the elk in that area. They didn't know where they came from, and they didn't know there was such a big bunch of elk in that area. But what they put in the elk management plan was, but I'm sure it's sustainable. Well, I can tell you where the bulk of them came from, and we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of elk that migrated when Yellowstone Park was on fire, and they stayed, and we still have them today. The same time I got to that ranch is when, in that part of Montana, instead of going to the forest and having a nice pasture and letting your cows graze all summer, that came to an end. And cows are not herd animals like elk and horses. A cow will take her calf and just spread out nicely over a big pasture, but that wasn't good enough. We had to have, because conservationists, and that's the nicest word I can use for the people who demanded this, and they really weren't conservationists because they didn't believe in good stewardship. They had one goal, and that was to remove cattle. But the conservationists decided that in this big pasture it would soon be 3 pastures, and one of them is non-use, it's rest rotation. So we lost 1/3 of our summer range, just like that, it was gone. But it was for wildlife, so, but you can't tell the elk that that one's for you. They like to live with the cattle. It led to every kind of problem. It was created to lead to every problem. And not only did you keep your cattle in the other 2/3, you had to keep them in 1/3 at a time. Say we went out there 40 years ago with 300 cows for 3 months. Today we are down to, well, actually 69 pairs, and maybe a month and a half if we're lucky. But every environmental issue that came up, and there were several of them, species, cattle had to be removed from the allotments, and this is federally mandated grazing allotments. This was an act of Congress. Cattle had to be removed because of elk, moose, sage grouse, elk security, elk calving ground, and west slope cutthroat. And then there was, I guess that's the species, and then the plants out there, every plant, if the willows were being terribly eaten because the wildlife population was growing, the willows were being eaten, so even more cattle had to go. The trampling, cattle had to go. The forage height on top of the hills and in the bottom, cattle had to go for all of that. So the only solution to each and every environmental issue out there was to remove cattle. And I watched that for 40 years. Equally depressing is when I went to the state legislature and started working on these issues. You know, if you have an agency that isn't in compliance with the law, you probably don't need to pass another law because they'll be in non-compliance of 2 of them. And I learned that the hard way. I passed a few laws my first few sessions, but at least they're on the books. And one of them from 2003 is that wildlife in Montana will be managed in a sustainable manner. And I didn't make it, or the legislature, it wasn't me. Once you introduce it, it's everyone. And we knew this would be a tough job to do, so we didn't say you have to do it now. The bill passed in 2003. They had until 2009 to bring that into compliance, and I don't think they've addressed it yet. And we have wildlife in so many places that are still over objective, and it's what they do to the private land. They're putting private landowners out of business.